On December 20th, 1860, a group of South Carolina secessionists set off a chain of events that ultimately resulted in the deaths of 620,000 American soldiers during 4 years of bloody Civil War. This presentation outlines the cause of the war from source documents of the men who lived during that time and made the decisions which led to the conflict. The unique aspect of this presentation is utilizing the truth of God's Word to shed light on the reason why the war was fought and God's purpose for America by allowing the war. The year began with the implementation of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Abolitionist Frederick Douglass had this to say about that momentous day.
The 1st of January, 1863, was a memorable day in the progress of American liberty and civilization. Here's a turning point in the conflict between freedom and slavery. A death blow was then given to the slaveholding rebellion. Until then, the federal arm had been more than tolerant to that relic of barbarism. We fought the rebellion, but not its cause. And now on this day of January 1st, 1863, the formal and solemn announcement was made that thereafter the government would be found on the side of emancipation. This proclamation changed everything.
Now the federal armies would have to win on the battlefield to accomplish this edict. When General Burnside was relieved of command, President Lincoln elevated General Joseph Hooker to the head of the Army of the Potomac. General Hooker schemed against General Burnside to have him removed and was reputed to have questionable moral character. Lincoln addressed Hooker's scheming in the letter of promotion sent to the general. The president stated,
"You have confidence in yourself, which is a valuable, if not an indispensable quality. You are ambitious, which within reasonable bounds does good rather than harm. But I think that during General Burnside's command of the army, you have taken counsel of your ambition and thwarted him as much as you could, in which you did a great wrong to the country and to a most meritorious and honorable brother officer. I much fear that the spirit which you have aided to infuse into the army of criticizing their commander and withholding confidence from him will now turn upon you."
General Hooker's practice of undermining others and his large ego would do him much harm in the upcoming battle. During the spring, General Hooker organized, trained, and built the morale of the army. By April, Hooker was ready to move and carry out his battle plan against General Lee and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. General Hooker boastfully proclaimed,
"My plans are perfect, and when I carry them out, may God have mercy on Bobby Lee, for I shall have none."
It would come to pass that God did have mercy on General Lee. The Battle of Chancellorsville took place from May 1st to May 4th, 1863 in Virginia. The Federal Army consisted of 130,000 men against 60,000 Confederate soldiers. When the battle ended, almost 30,000 Americans were casualties. General Lee took the greatest risk of his military career by dividing his army in the presence of a superior foe. General Jackson and his entire division marched around the Union flank and struck a surprising and devastating blow to the Federal Army. In Jackson's eagerness to press the attack, he moved with his officers between the lines of battle. In the darkness, Confederate troops mistakenly fired on Jackson and his group, killing 2 officers and wounding Jackson. Due to the severity of the wounds, the left arm of General Jackson was amputated. He was unable to be on the battlefield at the conclusion of one of the greatest Confederate victories of the war. When General Lee heard of Jackson's amputation, he stated,
"He has lost his left arm, but I'm my right."
General Jackson's wounds were healing, but he developed pneumonia. On Sunday, May 10th, 1863, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson passed out of this life. While on his deathbed, Jackson said,
"I see from the number of physicians that you think my condition dangerous, but I thank God, if it is His will, that I am ready to go."
His last words were,
"Let us pass over the river and rest under the shade of the trees."
The Southern victory was bittersweet with the loss of General Jackson. On the Federal side, General Hooker was humbled and responded that,
"To tell the truth, I just lost confidence in Joe Hooker."
Psalm 118 verse 8 tells us where our confidence is to be directed. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. As a result of the victory at Chancellorsville, General Robert E. Lee began preparing for a second invasion of the North. This time, the Army of Northern Virginia would enter Pennsylvania in June. President Lincoln prodded General Hooker to take action against General Lee's forces. However, it did not appear that Hooker would move in a timely manner. Finally, President Lincoln came to the conclusion that Hooker was not the man to lead the army and appointed General George Meade to command the Federal Army of the Potomac on June 28th. When General Meade was given the news that he was appointed to take over the army, he attempted to refuse the promotion. When told that the appointment was in order, he responded,
Well, I've been tried and condemned without a hearing, and I suppose I will have to go to the execution.
General George Meade was a steady commander with a proven record in battle. His major weakness was a quick temper and abrasiveness. He was described by a subordinate as an old, goggle-eyed snapping turtle. Little did General Meade realize that within 3 days of his appointment, the Army would fight the largest battle that ever took place on North American soil. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought in and around the little Pennsylvania town, would go down in history as the high tide of the Confederacy. The total Federal troops engaged at Gettysburg were 93,000, against total Confederate troops of 77,000. From July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, 170,000 American soldiers fought. This resulted in 53,000 casualties, or an astounding 31% of the troops involved in the battle. During the first 2 days of intense fighting, General Lee had attempted to attack the flanks of the Federal Army. On July 3rd, he decided to attack the middle of the Union line. Before sending the infantry, the Confederate artillery began an incessant firing with almost 150 cannons, the largest Southern bombardment of the war. For almost 2 hours, the artillery of both sides, around 300 guns, caused such a loud roar that the sound could be heard from as far away as Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. After the cannons ceased firing, Confederate General George Pickett's Virginians and other Confederate divisions, 12,500 men in all, began the assault of the Federal line. Facing this Confederate charge was Federal General Winfield Scott Hancock, and the center of the Union line, protected by a stone wall. Confederate General James Longstreet was in overall command of Pickett's charge and expressed reservations about this attack. He said to General Lee,
I've been a soldier all my life. I've been with soldiers engaged in fights by squads, companies, regiments, divisions, and armies, and should know as well as anyone what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position.
Lee did not reply to Longstreet's comment. General Pickett wrote of the unfolding charge.
Over on Cemetery Ridge, the Federals beheld a scene never before witnessed on this continent, a scene which has never previously been enacted and can never take place again. An army forming in line of battle in full view, under their very eyes, charging across a space nearly a mile in length, over fields of waving grain and anon of stubble, and then a smooth expanse, moving with the steadiness of a dress parade, the pride and glory soon to be crushed by an overwhelming heartbreak.
When the Confederates reached a certain point on the field, the Federals unleashed a devastating fire that cut down rebel soldiers. The Federal cannons used double canister, which were shells filled with iron balls that were similar to large shotgun shells, to inflict severe casualties. Only a few hundred Confederates ever reached the stone wall, and were quickly shot down or captured. Of the Confederate soldiers involved in the charge, 60% were casualties. The surviving rebels stumbled back to their lines. General Meade's response to the repulsion of the Confederates was simply,
Thank God.
General Lee was concerned that the Federals would counterattack, and seeing Pickett, ordered him to prepare his division. General Pickett replied,
General Lee, I have no division.
On July 4th, 1863, Independence Day, The Confederate Army retreated back to Virginia after suffering a decisive defeat at the hands of General Meade's army. Many historians believe that this battle was the turning point of the war. However, another Union victory in the Western Theater on July 4, 1863, contributed to the crippling of the Confederacy. While the Army of the Potomac was training during the spring in preparation for the offensive in the east, the Federal Army in the Western Theater was attempting to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi. The city of Vicksburg was called the Gibraltar of the West, a bastion overlooking the Mississippi River. General Grant and his men had attempted to capture the stronghold for months, but the results were unsuccessful. The strategic importance of Vicksburg was understood by both the North and South. President Lincoln stated,
"See what a lot of land these fellows hold, of which Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket."
After several battles near Vicksburg, the Federal forces settled in for a 47-day siege. General Grant was determined to take Vicksburg. A Union officer stated that Grant
habitually wears an expression as if he'd determined to drive his head through a brick wall and was about to do it.
On July 4th, the entire garrison of Vicksburg surrendered to Grant's army. Grant captured 30,000 soldiers, 60,000 small arms, and 172 cannon. This victory cut the South in two and gave the North control of the Mississippi River. The Confederate states of Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas were cut off from the rest of the Confederacy. The supply line was cut as the Mississippi River was in Union hands. Abraham Lincoln was quoted as saying,
"The Father of waters again goes unvexed to the sea."
Due to the bitterness of surrendering on July 4th, the citizens of Vicksburg did not officially celebrate Independence Day again until 1945, 82 years after the surrender. The loss of Gettysburg and Vicksburg was a double blow to the Confederacy. Independence Day took on a new meaning to the citizens of the North. It was not human power that turned the tide of the war. God was in control and changed the future of the war in just a few days. The combat and bloodshed in the Western Theater was far from over in the remaining months of 1863. One of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War was the Battle of Chickamauga, fought on September 19th and 20th, 1863 in northern Georgia. Chickamauga is a Cherokee phrase meaning river of blood. Two generals that played key roles in this battle were Federal General George Thomas and Confederate General James Longstreet. General Thomas was a native Virginian and stayed loyal to the Union during the Civil War, which enraged his family. His sisters turned his picture facing the wall so they would not have to look at him, and they destroyed all of his letters. His family would not reconcile with him for the remainder of his life. Thomas earned the name the Rock of Chickamauga during this battle. Confederate General James Longstreet was best friends with General Grant before the war and was in Grant's wedding. Longstreet was known as Lee's old warhorse and played a major role during this battle. The Battle of Chickamauga was fought just south of Chattanooga, Tennessee. The Federal Army of the Cumberland consisted of 57,000 men, and the Confederate Army totaled 66,000 soldiers. The casualties in this battle were close to 35,000 men, which was over 28% of the soldiers engaged in the conflict. Due to a mistake in orders, the Union line had a gap, which Longstreet's forces surged through, almost causing a rout of the Confederate Army. General Thomas's men fought a tenacious rearguard, saving the Union Army from a disaster. The Union Army suffered defeat and retreated to Chattanooga. Within days of the Confederate victory at Chickamauga, Southern troops began the siege of Chattanooga, Tennessee. The Confederates held Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain, two high points overlooking the city. The Federal troops trapped in Chattanooga began to run short on provisions. In October 1863, General Grant was promoted to the command of 3 Federal armies in the Western Theater, including the besieged Army of the Cumberland. Grant traveled to Chattanooga to determine a plan of action to break the siege. In less than a week after his arrival, a supply line called the Cracker Line had been opened into the city. Grant was determined to push the Confederates from the high points and devised a plan of attack. The final major battle during 1863 in the Western Theater took place on November 25th. Federal General George Thomas's 20,000-man Army of the Cumberland assaulted Confederate positions at the base of Missionary Ridge and captured them. Without orders to advance, the Federal troops continued up the steep slopes and drove the Confederates from Missionary Ridge. There were 13,000 casualties over the 3 days of fighting, and the Battle of Missionary Ridge ended with a significant Union victory. After the battle, when the Union dead were being arranged for burial, a chaplain asked General Thomas if the soldiers should be buried according to their states. General Thomas replied,
No, mix 'em up. I'm tired of states' rights.
On November 19, 1863, a ceremony was held in Gettysburg for the dedication of a cemetery for Union soldiers killed in the battle just a few months before. President Lincoln was invited to say a few appropriate remarks. His short speech would go down in history as one of the most famous orations ever given. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address concisely captured the epic struggle in America.
That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom.
For the slaves in this nation, the new birth of freedom had begun in this pivotal year. At the beginning of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was enacted. God had given the North 2 strategic victories by July 4th, America's Independence Day. By the end of the year, Negro soldiers were fighting for the North. God's hand in the Civil War would ensure that America would never be the same again. A former slave wrote about the injustice of slavery.
There can be no argument or fact adduced whereby to justify slavery as a moral right. Serving and being a slave are very different. There's no argument, no reason to justify slavery, save that of human cupidity. There will come a day when each and every one who has violated others will stand with a fearful accountability before the Supreme Judge.
The war was far from over, and many bloody battles remained to be fought in 1864.